I'm sorry, whatever case you want to make for it, it is just top to bottom, first moment to last moment, full of cliches.
Yeah.
Like they might be pleasurable cliches to you. I can't speak to what gives any particular person pleasure, but like in terms of just like the most basic element of like artistic craft, which is like not fill in the work with a bunch of fucking cliches. It doesn't even do like basic due diligence.
So movie macro number 6. Welcome, guys. I'm Alex Sheremet. I have Keith Jackewicz next to me. I every time that I say honestly movie macro number 6 or any number from now on, I'm going to be a little pissed off, right? Simply because we had that aliens thing that went south, so we only had 30 minutes of a 2-hour footage, which meant that I didn't want to put it into the movie macro lineage.
Mhm.
So I'm always going to have that little bit of thought, right? Always like a bit of wistfulness when I number these. But I guess officially this is movie macro number 6. We're going to be talking about James Cameron's Avatar 2, The Way of Water. Even saying that, right? It's like, you have that colors of Bruce Lee, right? With his famous speech about be like water, except just
Yeah.
not, except like in this case, is just not good, right?
Yeah, Bruce
And
Lee's more interesting.
yeah, like, and that's the thing. Like, you could pull up Bruce Lee talking about, be like water. The next to it, it's like, all right, if that's not your cup of tea, here's a dozen other things about a dozen other topics, and they are interesting to listen to. He's interesting to listen to. So before actually we get into Avatar 2, we actually just recorded a patron only show, me and Keith, and we discussed a wide variety of topics, right? So we talked about the recent spate of police brutality, Tyre Nichols. We talked about kind of like what we see as ethnic and maybe immigrant activism. I don't know, blackness in America. I forget exactly what directions we went off on that, but I'm sharing some stories from my personal life. We talked about Glenn Greenwald, this guy, Peter Zeihan, that I've been noticing more and more on YouTube and Twitter. Right, he had a Joe Rogan appearance sometime in the last month or so. Um, kind of like what exactly is going on, right, in terms of all these political writers who are just so kind of like hyper focused and maybe getting a specific set of ideas out. They totally forget any kind of craft, right? To the extent that you could differentiate any of these writers, maybe some of them go on way too long in articles, right? But beyond that, no kind of no way to sort of aesthetically differentiate these types. Keith, do you remember what else we discussed?
Um,
I should have written some of this down, right? But it's actually it's a pretty long comment. It's almost like 2 hours long. I think it might be even longer than the Avatar 2 discussion. So guys, if you wanna get that, that is patreon.com/automachination. You could see it in the show notes, you could see it on the screen. But let's get into Avatar 2 itself now for the hoi polloi.
hmm.
I just kept thinking watching Avatar 2, like whether it's like the poetic scenes in terms of like some of the strained attempts of Posey, or whether it's like some of the political stuff. I just kept thinking like, all right, is there anything in this movie that if I would have seen it as a teenager, my interpretation would be different now versus what it would have been, as like, I don't know, a junior or a senior in high school? And honestly, like the answer is no, right? I mean, there's really like, it's kind of weird. Like, who exactly is this audience, right? Because it's supposed to be these very heavy topics, right? We're talking about, colonization. We're talking about genocide. We're talking about, resource exploitation. We're talking about a group of people that are very obviously a stand-in for the American Army, the Marine Corps. In fact, the Marines are mentioned explicitly and very weirdly, although this is, a century and a half in the future. Um, there's still the same kind of like Southern kind of accents and the same kind of Marine Corps ideology that you could find today or, in the last few decades. So this is supposed to be kind of like heavy stuff. But at the same time, it's just treated in the way that a teenager would treat it, like if you're like a kid that just got into politics as a junior, you'd make some shit like this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that it is a, hundreds of millions of dollars movie where you are very clearly supposed to root for clear, like, cognates of the American military, just getting wrecked, getting killed, and like there's no ambiguity about whether they are the bad guys or not. I mean, that's interesting. Like, it kind of makes it interesting as and the first Avatar as well, I guess, interesting as like sociological objects of study. You know, like the idea of someone basically getting so successful and powerful in the film industry that they can make something that like basically says that the entire power structure that the film industry is built on, which, the Hollywood is arguably another arm of the military in terms of modern imperialism, in terms of spreading the influence of American culture all throughout the world. It's the propaganda arm of it's the effective propaganda arm of the American state in a lot of ways. So the fact that someone like James Cameron could basically just be so financially successful in his past endeavors that he can put something together like this and get this approved and like pass all of the filters that would usually filter out this ideology from a movie. I guess that, I mean, that's kind of interesting. It's certainly it's a lot of spectacle. I between this one and Avatar 1, I would say this is the best version of the 3D revival that's sort of come in over the last like 11 years. It's weird, like 3D kind of went away and then Cameron brought it back for this, even though like 3D hasn't really been that popular for several years at this point, I would say. But like, it looks good. It's like pretty. Did you see it in 3D?
Um, I did see in 3D. Most of the time I was not wearing the 3D glasses, but when I did put them on, I mean, I did want to talk about the visuals because I kept thinking like, all right, so like if you don't wear the 3D glasses, it's going to be blurry. You put them on now, it's sort of the way it's supposed to be seen. But does it, what exactly is it adding? All that kind of like technical, detail that's added, it seems just kind of like much more of a distraction, right? Like there was something very cartoony about it, and yet not in a way that's like it doesn't add to the meaning in some way, right? In some ways, I definitely preferred kind of like the visual appearance of number one in the same way, and I think there's definitely a connection here. Like if you look at some of what happens in video games from the 90s into the 2000s and into the 2010s, the more layers that you added, right, visually or whatever else, right, what you did primarily was kind of force yourself to like really get dated, right? In some ways, like what Avatar 1 did visually, Avatar 2 it's not a substantial jump, right? And yet, if you look at, for instance, a video game between the 90s versus like 2006 tries to be realistic enough where 10, 15 years later, it's now so dated. Whereas like, a pixel sort of game from the 90s won't have that kind of feeling of looking so dated, right? Because it's kind of like, well, it wasn't ever meant to be so extremely realistic. And
Yeah, no, I know
here,
what you mean.
and here, like, there's kind of this cartoony quality to number two that it's almost as if like trying to distract you from all the kind of poverty of everything else that's on the screen,
Yeah, no, I shouldn't have even said that they're both, because I actually think Avatar 1 is a little better, just because I think the last action scene in Avatar 1 is like a more masterful use of Cameron's geospatial cinematographic sense,
Hmm.
like there's really a sense of scale there, and objects moving in space, and the way that it's like visually signaled like where everything is in relation to everything else, and like what's happening. There is a real, like, it's schlock, but it's kind of virtuosically conceived schlock in that one. Whereas there's really no scene in Avatar 2 that like it is like viscerally enjoyable in the way that like the last battle scene in the first movie is in my memory. I mean, I haven't seen the first one for a few years, but I remember it pretty well. I actually saw that one multiple times because I saw that myself, and then my dementia addled grandfather, I took him to the movie theater to watch that, because it's funny, I mean, this was the early stages of his dementia at that point. So, but he was someone who served in Korea, and he didn't necessarily either didn't pick up on or didn't care that it was like basically being critical of like his prior service or whatever. So he's just like, it was a nice story. That was a nice story. But you ask who the audience was. I mean, the audience is apparently the entire planet, because this movie has already made $2 billion,
Hmm.
and probably will. I mean, I don't think it's going to make as much money because I'm actually not sure where the first Avatar now ranks on like the all-time box office. But this is, I mean, this is the lowest common denominator. I mean, there's really no
Hmm.
other way to phrase it like this. And the fact that I guess its politics are somewhat daring for Hollywood, in the sense that like, but even then, it's not. I mean, I guess it's daring in the sense that like something like Dances with Wolves or Fern Gully or other kinds of, or other things that it's been compared to historically, Pocahontas. It's just, sometimes it's more like elegiac, like, well, isn't it thrilling to see the resistance, but what's going to happen to these poor Native Americans. So really it's like just kind of soothing your own sense of moral complicity in the colonization and the genocide and whatever. Whereas this one is, I guess, more hopeful in a sense. Like, it's the idea that you really can resist, and that like there really is like a violent solution that is possible to all of these forces that are shaping our lives or whatever. And I guess that's a little more radical, but ultimately, like, it's a movie where cartoons go through the jungle and go through the water, and they hang out with jellyfish and whales, and like, it's not poetically done enough that it's like really like, it's a even if it's more pro revolution than the average like Hollywood movie, it's not like exactly challenging Hollywood structure.
Hmm.
Like, it's not, for a movie that's anti-colonizer, it certainly is not above using like the colonizers fucking aesthetic forms. It's certainly not above using basically the same like soul subduing tropes that like are disseminated through the American media like every single day to every corner of the world. I mean, I guess the fact that there's like a half-hour stretch in the middle here where they're just like swimming underwater and saying cliche things like on voiceover, like a really like one of the later Terrence Malick movies where he really got
Hmm.
off the rails. There's but not even that, because Terrence Malick, like some of Terrence Malick's later stuff gets a little cringy, but like he's trying at least, he's at least trying to be poetic, whereas this is like come on.
Well, what about like,
Like, you had fucking 13 years to write this thing, and you couldn't find, so you couldn't pay someone to do like good, like, what is the crown of the continent guy, what's he the
Gabrowska or
yeah,
something?
like,
Yeah, something like that.
someone with like a more of a poetic ear to talk about nature, like someone, like, you can't
Oh,
have someone say something
that's what you meant by
interesting.
trying. Because I would say like, well, to a lot of people, they would like, oh, Way of Water, right? This is poetry, right? I mean, to Cameron, right? He might very well feel that too, right? I mean, it's kind of weird that he would work on this for so long. I think this was going on since like 2017 or something like that. And it would have all these ideas and wants to do this, wants to do that, and then just like, did he really feel upon release like, all right, I should have worked on the dialogue and the sort of like, more poetic elements to make them good, or did he just
No,
think like, yeah, I just made a masterpiece, great, let's go?
well, I mean, based on interviews, that's absolutely what he thinks. Like
That he made a masterpiece.
yeah, no, there was fucking there was an episode of Chapel where they were reading some interview with James Cameron where he was talking to, I think it was in the New York Times or New Yorker or one of those big things, and he was talking to some executive and saying something to the effect of like, the time to love the movie is now, not after it comes out and it's successful. You are all in on what I'm fucking doing now. That's like berating some executive that was expressing some reservation about the movie or something like that. I mean, like
But
I
even
mean,
that seems almost like a business and like transaction type of comment, you know what I mean?
well, I mean, James Cameron hasn't really been an artist for like almost 30 years at this point. Like the last movie he made that like you could sort of make a case for somewhat is like True Lies, right? Like, and even then that's like, already getting down the rabbit hole of just like, pretty commercial. Like all this stuff is commercial, but even True Lies is just like a somewhat clever inversion of like, of like Arnold Schwarzenegger action spy kind of stuff, and not even a total inversion. Like plenty of it is just straight up just like a regular ass Arnold Schwarzenegger movie or whatever. But Terminator 2 came out in 91, I think 92, whenever.
Yeah, one of those two, 91
Yeah,
or two.
so like that's the last great movie that he made, and then he made Titanic, which I know there's a Titanic defenses movement in social media right now, but come on, like
Mhm.
nobody really thinks Titanic is a great movie. Like nobody. uh, it's one of those. These are like they're the movie equivalent of like fiber. They, I guess, they pass through you, and they don't make you sick, but they're not necessarily giving you a lot. There's not really any like nutrients that are being sucked up either. It's just like the most palatable, internationally palatable, perhaps is the way to say, like, form of like, lowest common denominator Hollywood kind of dreck. I mean, and it's weird because there's such a, I mean, the only reason that I saw this, and I guess that it came up as something that we could watch, is there is this like weird like avatar loving subculture in like modern leftism, I guess, because
Is
it
there?
does. Yeah, no, that absolutely. I mean, it depends. I think there's and specifically it's a meme from Chapel Trap House, so it's a little difficult. I don't want to talk about them very much, but like they are huge boosters of the franchise as like having more substance and more like revolutionary, like socialistic bona fides than it's like been given credit for in the mainstream media or whatever. And it's like, I'm sorry, whatever case you want to make for it, it is just top to bottom, first moment to last moment, full of cliches.
Yeah.
Like they might be pleasurable cliches to you. I can't speak to what gives any particular person pleasure, but like in terms of just like the most basic element of like artistic craft, which is like not fill in the work with a bunch of fucking cliches, it doesn't even do like basic due diligence to to like respect the audience.
Mhm.
You can only make like a purely 100% like this was like an inspiring movie to me, or it's like it was so like seeing all this unsullied nature was just so beautiful. Like all these people are like, oh, I cried watching this thing. Like, are you kidding me? you know like
When I was in the theater, it was a matinee, so there was only like four other people there. Very comfy seats too. That's the thing. AMC theaters, I can understand where the stock went up.
yeah
Very comfortable seating, right? Much more so than kind of like the indie movie theaters that I typically go to here.
yeah no
Um,
that's well, they got to justify the $20 tickets or
and
whatever they're
there
charging.
were just like literally on the other side of the theater, there were just like some teenagers there that were making out. That's like
Yeah,
it's like a teenager make out movie. right? It's
Well, I
not,
mean, it's been out for a
it's
while
not for
now,
adult, yeah, it's not for adult tears though. That's, that it is kind of absurd, right? To think a grown up sitting there crying.
Yeah,
Um,
that's what I don't. I mean, maybe things are just in some ways like so politically hopeless right now that like just something that presents like a positive affirmative vision of like resistance and struggle and like overcoming the tendencies of modern life and the trajectory that we're on. It's just it's cathartic in a way that like a more healthy society would not produce like a crop of people that like watch something like this and they're like, I want to go to Pandora. I wish I could live there. It's like
mhm.
I don't know. I can't imagine another moment in history where like people that are otherwise have pretensions to like serious, intellectual gravitas or whatever would like try to make a case for something like this. But you
Yeah,
know,
I mean, in terms of like beyond just having just like naked cliches in pretty much every sentence that's uttered. There was also like I think even more grating, or maybe equally grating, was the fact that, so like the children, right, of these Navi beings, um they're all talking like like American Zoomers, or kids in middle school, right? Kids in high school. They're using the same slang. They're using the same intonations. And it's stuff that you could tell is gonna be so dated within a decade or two, but they are it's just, this is what fills the bulk of the kind of like more, I guess, aesthetic parts of dialogue, when you get to like interjections and
yeah.
stylization. Like it's very, very silly and grating to listen to.
I
um
don't remember that component I mean, I saw it
like they kept
over.
they kept calling each other like, bro, what are you doing, bro? And then one of the girls was like, oh, that's sick, like shit like that.
Well, I don't know about
um
I mean, I'll give it some credit in that like the two kids are the son of like an or are the sons of an Earth human, so they may
mhm.
have picked up slang. Like he may talk with like a certain amount of Earth slang,
But like, I mean, like, this is a
or
century and a
or it
half,
might just be that that's like the English translation of like a Navi word that has like a similar connotation to like bro or whatever. Like it might just be that that's because the whole thing is like they're supposed to be talking in Navi, but he says at the start like, well, it's over time it just started to sound like English to me, and
Mhm.
that's the excuse for having everything be English speaking dialogue, even though like they're supposed to, in the context of the movie, be speaking Navi. Like you're
Mhm.
sort of seeing it like through his eyes of like it sounds like English to him now because he's become felicitous with the language or whatever. So
Mhm.
I can cut it slack on that because you are. I mean, that might just be what it would sound. Like those might be the closest cultural equivalents of the Navi phrase. But I mean, you're absolutely right that like they never feel like aliens really.
Mhm.
Like they never like they just it's just blue people.
Yeah.
Like
I was going to ask about that aspect. So like the fact that this is a totally different planet and these are supposed to be radically different looking beings, the wildlife is supposed to look very, very different and behave differently than what we're used to. Does that really do anything? Because like, I mean, when I think about even something as simple as like what genres people decide to write in, if someone decides to write a sci-fi book or a book that is like in the fantasy genre, I always ask like, well, okay, so what specifically is it that you want to work in this genre? Like, like, what is it allowing you to do or say that you can't do in more kind of like generic realistic fiction? right? And among the best done genre work, right? There's some specific answers that you could give, even if it's just like as simple as plotting devices and stuff like that, and that kind of like more generic excitement, whatever, what have you. But like I wonder, like what does this allow? Like it's just like over the top differences that don't actually really beyond the kind of purely visual way. That, by the way, like this is why you get the 3D glasses, this is why you got to do this. Like this is why they're putting all these like special requirements on you, the viewer, right? Like what does it actually add, right? The fact that these are 10-foot tall blue humanoids. You can understand why they're humanoids, right? You want some level of empathy, but at the same time, like beyond that very, very basic thing, what does this do exactly? What's the point of this genre over any other?
I mean, I think the point is just that you can't have audiences, cheering like contemporary 21st century American troops
Yeah.
getting killed.
Mm-hmm.
And you couldn't even really do like like some sort of like alt history of like a reality where like Native Americans are somehow successful like in repelling European colonization or whatever. Like you could be more likely to do something like that, but it's too much risk of appropriation, too much and of like blowback from indigenous groups, and too much too many people would be like, well, but that's what made America, like, so this just lets you, it lets you get your political rocks off,
Mm-hmm.
like, and the thing is, like, like the basic politics of this movie, like the basic notion that it would like, a world where like the Native Americans like just completely remove Europeans from like the American continent, through some sort of like violent armed struggle, and like push them out of like every place that they came to identify. Like I'm fond of, that's like that's obviously true to me, like not to say that everything that probably would have entailed would have been morally justified, but they would have been entirely justified in doing pretty much whatever, like on the whole, like whatever it took to like get the fucking Europeans like off of Turtle Island, as some PC types are now wanting to call it or whatever. Like the idea that any sort of like struggle to repel European colonizers like would have been basically justified, and probably historically preferable in some ways in terms of like the world that we're now inheriting. Like I'm in like basic agreement with like the politics of the movie
Mm-hmm.
overall, but like you have $300 million. Like the only interesting sci-fi concept is the idea of a planet where everything is like neurally interfaced with everything else. The idea of like a planet as a natural computer system and natural intelligence or whatever, that every individual organism is like a sub species of, and where everyone retains a sort of like holistic spiritual connection to the environment, because there's just so much abundance that there's no reason to disturb the natural balance, and you have like an actual cognitive connection to everything else. That's I guess interesting enough as a science fiction concept, but it's like it's also like it's they have the big giant. I mean, this was a point made in a video review of the original Avatar by Red Letter Media, of all people, who are famous for making fun of Star Wars for 9 hours or whatever. But the Disney eyes, like it's not fucking challenging to make people feel sympathy for like these beautiful 8 foot tall cat people with big beautiful Disney eyes that have so much like
And
emotional expression,
everybody has
like
abs, right? There's like some level of like athleticism and musculature,
yeah,
right?
like
It's funny when you like read some of the comments under like Avatar 1, right? Because it's like further in the past, and maybe some kids saw it during that time, and it's full of like adults that were kids then, right? And they say stuff like, there was like one woman that was like, oh, I remember seeing this movie. One of the top comments, it was like, I remember seeing this movie when I was a child, when I was like, 9 or 10 years old. And I also really remember like having like a crush on one of the like the female lead, whoever, I forget her name. What is her name?
Zoe
Neytiri.
Saldana. Yeah,
Neytiri.
Neytiri is the character.
Yeah,
Yes,
because well, she had the crush in the character. She said Neytiri, and like people love that. They're like, whoa, great, let's talk about that.
yeah.
And it's like it's full of like comments from like people that used to be kids, right? Just kind of like essentially reminiscing. And beyond that, right? Like because you did mention the fact that, right, so it is true that because these are big blue people and not just like Native Americans, right, versus very obvious like American Marines or whatever, that does allow you to like discuss all this without having this whole big other entanglement and discussion. That is true, but at the same time, the reason why I'm asking kind of like, I guess, more broadly, why, like, whether or not the fact that it's this like extreme genre movie, whether that actually adds anything is it does really tend to defang any kind of like potential discussion, right? Because like, all right, so like it is true that Hollywood is this kind of like arm of American propaganda, even when they're not talking about just basic sort of like military type stuff, right, or invasions and trying to whitewash Iraq or whatever it might be. To the extent that you have any like American movies that go popular, like in Europe, they go popular in, maybe sometimes some stuff goes popular in China, right? It wouldn't surprise me if Avatar was popular in China. I don't know that, but it wouldn't surprise me, right? If it was allowed to be played. There's definitely, American stuff that makes it into Russia, South America. So it's spreading of American culture, American values. And I can also imagine, something like a movie like this or a movie like Wakanda. It's like, oh, we thought Americans, like if there's like countries that are resentful against America, we thought, Americans were, these people who are, they're very insensitive and they don't understand really what they're doing to the world. And yet here we have like the most the biggest movie of 2022 and 2023. It's out here making this kind of wider political comment, like maybe there's something changing, but it's really, like the only reason why a movie like Black Panther exists or a movie like this might exist is there's a sufficient number of like middle class people or whatever that are willing to shell out money for this kind of entertainment, right? And maybe some of them have, maybe someone that goes see I think Black Panther has maybe more of that kind of direct sort of people that are interested in politics or whatever, whereas here this kind of like more just like generic entertainment. I can imagine, people watching that and being like, you know what? It seems like culturally there's kind of turnaround. Maybe it means, XYZ, right? And they're extrapolating something from this that is totally unnecessary and outside of reality. Like I could also imagine that kind of happening as well, right? So it seems like whatever political commentary you could make, like it is defanged not only by the presence of just like total cliches and other kind of hack work, but also this like, we have to make it so extreme to even have this conversation, right? And also just like an aside note in terms of like back to these like video game connections, like hearing a guy in 2150 who sounds very much like a Marine from the American South, right, with the accent and everything, and this is now 2150. It's a lot like I'm not sure if you ever played StarCraft 2, but the generals or whatever in the Terran, right, which is the human analog, they clearly have like, they often have like a Southern twang. They are supposed to also be like American type Marines, but this is also something that's taking place like way into the future, right? And we keep getting like, the same kind of aesthetics of like modern, Marines, or the aesthetic, or like, teenage slang. Like, why does it always seem to like make its way into this sort of like mass entertainment, right? Well, I mean, the answer is obvious, right? It makes its way into mass entertainment because it makes it far more easy to digest and makes the connections far more easy to make. But even Cameron himself, he's like, look, when he was responding to like allegations of like cultural appropriation or whatever with Native Americans, maybe we could talk about that next. He was like, look, with all the people talking about cultural appropriation, this is not supposed to be a very subtle story. We have indigenous groups that are being harassed and destroyed by invaders that look a lot like Europeans, right? This is actually good, right? So he himself knows how kind of like over the top, unsubtle this is, but he takes that as a positive, right? So anyway.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's, I mean, on some level, you do have to value like non-obviousness and non-cliche, which is, unfortunately used to be a given in most like art criticism discourse, but in the era of poptimism and the collapse of the distinction between high and low art, and there's values in all of these sorts of trends, but when it leads to you like just completely uncritical, I mean, it's great. I guess it's great that there's a blockbuster that takes the side of like Native American and or indigenous and marginalized people like pretty unabashedly, and celebrates like their acts of violence and resistance against their oppressors. Like that's that's cool, I guess, but like you still have to watch the fucking thing, and it's just, I mean, I would be lying if I said there weren't certain things about this movie that were like viscerally thrilling, like the scene where the whale comes out of the water and just like completely smashes the whaling / battleship that all of
that made me
the
feel
Marines.
good. Definitely. I liked seeing it, right?
Yeah, no,
Right.
it's like, that's thrilling. You fuck it, like it makes you hate you hate the humans, you said, they're bad people. You like seeing them get killed in various ways, but like, so like it's pretty easy to, and like ultimately I like there's a solid case to be made that like plenty of American and European behavior in the world more generally like has an almost like cartoonish evil to it, like at times, like that, certainly that's true, but at the same time, like, the whole thing about art is like you're supposed to get at something from like an unexpected angle, right? Or you're supposed to offer like, you're not just supposed to offer like colloquial truths presented in colloquial language, like it should,
colloquial truth and colloquial phrasing, right?
yeah.
Colloquial aesthetic trappings as well.
Yeah, it's like,
Yeah.
it's like it's real easy to have, the like to win sympathy for these, big beautiful native people against like uh against the like the big bad, like cartoonishly bad American military. Like, okay, but if this was like, if this was something like, like a Solaris kind of alien presence, like this sort of like truly distributed consciousness, and like the beings that we're interfacing with is like sentient moss, or like, like sentient clouds of gas or something like that, and like something truly alien and truly like outside of the, the like our imaginative purview of like what is a being that could have an aggrievement against extraction and colonization, but that's not just like obviously, some indigenous humans like with a cat culture, like, you have $300 million in complete free reign, and you do absolutely nothing to push forward like science fiction as a medium. You don't, like, the only thing you push forward is like the worst part of Hollywood, which is the over reliance on expensive and resource intensive visual effects, substituting a spectacle for story, like, I'd say the most dire predictions for Hollywood have probably come from, like, ironically enough, the lowest common denominator schlockmeisters themselves, like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, who have basically predicted like that there's going to be like two film industries by like 2050. There's going to be like maybe 5 or 6 like big thrill ride spectacle roller coaster like Cirque du Soleil type blockbusters that come out every year, and then there will probably be like an extremely low budget like art movie like, you know, Patreon, GoFundMe like level of financed like art film industry that will probably have, you know, because of the decentralized financial backing that it's probably going to require to, you know, be kept in existence, probably have like, you know, pretty poor quality control mechanisms overall. So, and I mean, this is someone who could do anything and has shown in the past that he has like some ability to imagine like an artful way to use like what would in different hands be like lowest common denominator, like Hollywood shtick or
Mhm.
whatever. But he does nothing to take advantage of the intense freedom, you know, that he's been granted. And I think it's just that he's not interested in art. He's a technology guy now. You know, he got interested in submarines, so he made Titanic so he could go down in a submarine and shoot the Titanic. He got interested in like, because I think the technology of Avatar is the innovation was that there was like software that created like sort of a rudimentary CGI like as the motion capture was happening so that he could sort of like see the shot in a like a clearer sense instead of just like filling everything in post or whatever. And then in this one, it's like the underwater motion capture that he basically had to spend like 8 years inventing before he could actually like start shooting whatever concept he had for an Avatar 2. And you know, and the thing is, this is still more interesting than like Marvel. So in terms of like big spectacle Hollywood shit, like I'll probably still see Avatar 3 because like what the fuck else are you gonna go see in a movie theater that like takes advantage of like the big movie theater experience? You know, like big surround sound and originals. Like I'm not gonna go see a fucking Star Wars movie. I'm not gonna see a Marvel movie. Like this is pretty much one of the only original movies that like like not based on like a pre-existing thing, like one of the few franchises that is like, I guess, original to this, you know, to the cinema of the last, you know, 15 years or whatever. But it's like, how sad is it that like this is where people feel like they have to go to get their like, you know, to get thrilled, you know,
Mhm.
like I don't know. I mean,
I wonder if the just the longevity, right, of if they're imagining in 2050 big blockbusters versus whatever else. I mean, the movie industry in general has been, seeing like more difficulty, like in terms of profits for a while now. That probably has to do with video games.
mhm.
I only imagine both like things like the metaverse, right? We're gonna have like lots of competing metaverses, both open source and publicly owned, as well as stuff that's like Facebook is going to have a metaverse. All these, everything's going to be sort of siloed off in some ways. People will be in that, right? People will be playing ever more sort of like insidious games in terms of how they hook you in and for how long. There's going to be discoveries on that front. I can't imagine people still being so into the conventional, all right, a 2 hour, 3 hour, maybe 4 hour, like totally epic experience on the big screen. Um, partly for those reasons, because like there's no right now, there's no difference between watching something like Avatar versus saying, all right, I'm just going to play a video game for 3 4 hours, right? In terms of what you get intellectually from it, in terms of the ways that you get stimulated, whatever might technical novelties or innovations might come in one or the other, they're probably not going to be of some sort of like shattering variety. So both experiences are equivalent to the extent that watching My Dinner with Andre is very different from playing a video game or watching Avatar, right? There's a lot more difference in that specific activity than there would be the differences between playing a game versus watching Avatar, right? So, but there's I don't want to say there's necessarily like no interest whatsoever in some of this more art house stuff. I definitely do think there's going to be, some contingent of people that are, they're just going to get tired and bored of like phones and Twitter and, big Hollywood type stuff. Like, a lot of times like people escape their addictions, not even necessarily because of some huge kind of moment of insight. It could be as simple as, you know what? I just got so fucking tired of like, whatever, my phone. I got so tired of this. I got so tired of that. Right. And I can imagine there being an increasingly tired group of people that would hunt for things that are, not, it's not going to be the kind of dopamine rush that you get from a movie like that. It would be more so maybe something a little more, something more subtle. Right. Because that would be the only thing. Because eventually it's like the thrills can't get any bigger eventually. Right. Eventually the thrills are just kind of like, they're just too big for their own good. So maybe subtlety is going to be something that happens more in the future. I mean, who knows?
Yeah, I mean, it's not even as, because like, I mean, I guess the visual effects in this do look good for the most part, but like there's almost this thing where like the better CGI gets, like somehow the faker it looks to me. Like,
yeah, I mean, that's what I meant about this, like Avatar 1 versus 2. Like, it's just too slick, right? This, just too slippery and slick, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first one kind of had that. I mean, there was more show-offy stuff in this one, like more like real humans and like computer graphics, like in the same shot kind of shots, like to show how seamlessly integrated it is. I mean, it is good, but like nothing in this to me, like, like you watch Terminator 2 and everything was shot with practical effects, like there's such a weight to that, and there's a real creativity in figuring out like how to make a miniature look like a full-size thing. Like there is a real craft to that. I mean, there's just so, like, you can up the stakes and the thrills however much you want, but the more that it is just so clearly like a computer graphic, like the less thrilling it gets, paradoxically, because it's like there's no real way. It's like you said, you might as well just play a video game, because at least a video game, there's tactile feedback that sort of substitutes for like the visceral thrill of like seeing something actually blow up or whatever. I like watching a car explode. I don't like watching a CGI car have a CGI explosion. So if I'm gonna watch a CGI explosion, I might as well like be causing it by pressing a button. Or
yeah,
whatever.
exactly. And all three of those are more or less kind of their equivalent events, right? Whether you cause a car explosion or you saw a real one, or if it's kind of like in a more cartoony way, right? You're kind of like break the immersion a little bit. But that's the thing. I think, in a weird way, Avatar 1 will be seen as less visually dated than Avatar 2, because like that's the thing, when you start upping the ante in that way, you now open yourself up to becoming dated. Like I think that 90s film Ants, right? I think it's well written. I think it's good, but it's definitely kind of hard to watch right now, right? If you're watching, but back then it was like, wow, this is crazy. But and that's the thing. One of the sad things is it's one of these, it's one of the better written and acted and whatever animated films, like, from that era. And yet now you're dealing with the fact that, okay, well, if I show this to somebody, I have to make sure that they're able to appreciate the writerly aspects, because Ants is dated. And I think Avatar 2, I could definitely see places where it's going to get dated. Like in the same way, again, back to video games. Like if you look at the difference between Oblivion, Elder Scrolls game in 2006 versus a fully modded Skyrim in 2023, same series, different games. But the fact is, because Oblivion tried to be so realistic, now it's simply going to look dated, because we've had almost 20 years that passed since that point, in the same way that these other games are going to get dated. So when you start playing like a purely aesthetic game, you're kind of almost right away like sowing the seeds of your own kind of undoing long term, right? Whether it's like a purely, like there's like people that are into different like niche genres or time periods, like in film or whatever, because they really love that aesthetic. They love, like, I don't know, the 1930s, 1940s, let's say, like, gangster movie, right? Well, eventually it's like it's going to look kind of it's going to get more and more niche, right? Because it's just like an aesthetic decision. Or whether it's like, like cool art, whatever was considered cool in the 90s or whatever was considered cool in the 60s. Well, because you're literally saying I'm marrying a fad, it's not going to be the cool thing anymore, 50 years later. So like aesthetics really does do this odd thing where like people get really involved in it, and yet like the more attention that you pay to it, the more important that you make it in the meantime, long term you're making it less and less important, right? Whatever
Yeah.
the end product is.
Yeah, well, especially if it's not even like creative aesthetics,
Yeah,
like,
yeah, that's what I'm talking about. It's just like,
certain
it's just like
things that like,
genre.
yeah, certain things you like, you could be obsessive to aesthetic detail, but if you're actually doing something interesting, then it'll, it'll hold up, but this is, something like this. The thing is, it's even hard for me to imagine like some sort of kitschy appreciation of like of these like CGI fests of this era,
Mhm.
because it's so like the and it really just comes back to the writing. Like writing as a craft has been so devalued and so denigrated. Like, things just get more and more childish and faddish over time, and especially the more we get into an era where the people that are writing and making the movies are like, they spend time on the internet,
Mhm.
and they osmose like the worst linguistic and
Mhm.
rhetorical habits of the internet, and they feel in conversation with the
Mhm.
internet and with social media, and like they have to include things like
Mhm.
with a mind to, pre-silencing certain social media critics that might crop up or whatever in the
Mhm.
meantime. Like the that was certainly a criticism that I saw of. I saw you make fun of that new Netflix movie, Glass Onion, on Twitter, saying something like, "I, imagine wanting to watch this like fucking pabulum that is this
Yeah,
movie."
they're
But
all
that was,
talking about it, and it's like the only reason why they would talk about it is like let's see, like people like Ben Shapiro, right? It's like let me extract like just like such like philistines, right? Just so like the only reason they would ever touch any kind of artwork is because they think they could extract something of financial value for themselves based on whatever audience that they cultivate. So it's going to be taking a political angle, like it's just no understanding and no reason to engage in the arts for any reason other than, again, pure financialization, right?
well, that's, and that, that's, it's just because it's just more culture war shit, like, and nobody cares about the arts as arts anymore. I mean, not nobody, but like it's shrinking year by year by year, like people, like, the number of people that could appreciate like a good work of art by like a right-wing artist, like Stagecoach is,
Mm-hmm.
you could say, clearly kind of a right-wing work of art, in the sense that like it might challenge certain class distinctions, but it's ultimately a movie where like Native Americans are, portrayed as this like, mindlessly violent and like threatening force, and the taming influence of the American settlers and frontiers, over this like wild land or whatever. Like, you could, I mean, maybe reactionary right wing's not exactly the right characterization, but it is certainly friendly to like, the two right wing interests, to
Mm-hmm.
characterize the manifest destiny as like a civilizing force or whatever, you
Mm-hmm.
know and as the birth of something new and uniquely good and American or whatever, but it's a great movie,
Mm-hmm.
but I would like, it is a genuinely pleasurable and well written work of art, even if like, you know, its politics are not anything that you could possibly like signal support for or whatever, you know. But the number of people that could appreciate that as a work of art and not either you know, and not get hung up on the politics or start celebrating it just to be like a contrarian reactionary asshole, you know, like, is getting smaller and smaller over time. And it's I mean, I really I'm almost coming to the conclusion that like I actually think the internet has on negative been like a bad thing, you know, like whatever good it's done, and whatever like good possibilities it portended at the time that it was developed, like it's been so captured by like, you know, like mechanisms of surveillance and like, you know, these algorithmic like content aggregation services that drive everything toward the lowest common denominator, that
Yeah.
all it
I mean,
does is
even in Google search, right? You start seeing that now, right? It's
Google's not
increasingly
as good as it used to be,
yeah,
man.
it's not as a specific, it's not as niche. Also, it's not
And
you
you
know, the
get so many
result.
fucking ads.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
anything you
Or you get shit that is like, you know, how many times you come across an article and you're like, this is obviously written by an AI, or
yeah.
at best it's written by a non-native English speaker somewhere in a different country that's doing some sort of like content mill,
Yeah.
right? I don't understand how Google doesn't like automatically punish that kind of like very cheap sort of content. I mean, technically it's supposed to, but you know, who knows?
Well, but I mean, Google is in such a like, despite being one of the largest companies in the world, like they don't actually do that much from which you could like generate a profit. You know,
Yeah.
like the profit is in some sense like, you know, purely speculative, like purely the notion that like the advertisements are going to draw customers, and that the way that they craft their search engine is such that they will influence future behavior toward like
Mhm.
particular ends, you know. And the you would think that Google should automatically punish like, you know, these sites that do like AI generated content or whatever, but you know, that's just another thing that you could, you know, like the whole ecosystem is like dependent on basically just there being as much, you know, keeping this speculative advertising, like online advertising bubble alive for as long as possible, because
Mhm.
ultimately like the internet hasn't really developed a truly sustainable economy for itself, because like like the idea that you just like you got to pay for shit, you know, like like advertising cannot finance like an entire like huge piece of cultural infrastructure, you know. Like I would much, you know, I would much rather pay for like a good search engine that doesn't favor those kinds of algorithmically or AI generated bullshit, that doesn't prioritize results that have paid them to be prioritized,
Mhm.
and that actually has an incentive to get better at being a search engine and find, because usually if I'm searching for something, I'm probably searching for something niche. You know,
Mhm.
like if I know I want a specific New York Times article, I can just go on the New York Times and type it into their search bar. But if I'm looking for something, you know, more off the beaten path, Google's become terrible for that.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
and I would pay money for a search engine that was like better at finding things, but wasn't as complex and sensitive as like research library, you know, like a user friendly scholarly interface
Yeah.
is absolutely something that I would rather just like pay for instead of, but you know, instead of it being this like advertiser funded monstrosity. And the same thing for like social networks. Like I like something that is just some kind of social network where you can see what people are talking about, that doesn't like try to guess what it is that you want to see and feed it to you and maximize the time that you spend onto it and maximize the time that you waste on it, that doesn't feed you like sponsored content or whatever. Like something like that would be worth, you know, I mean, Wikipedia has a lot of problems, but the fact that it's funded by people actually donating to it and um paying for it somewhat, like that has certainly kept it to a certain purity of what I mean. The problems with Wikipedia are all like social, basically, right? It's like these weird editors that get on a power trip and try to like box out alternate understandings of like a particular figure or mood, or whatever, people that decide this is the way the article is going to read and this is what I want it to say, and I have enough power and longevity that I can twist it to my own end. But like a social phenomenon is something you can work through, but something that is like so perverted by like weird financial incentives that are frankly opaque and of questionable actual real world utility in terms of like generating what it promises. Like, I can't speak to it, but it certainly seems like the research consensus is emerging that advertisement is not nearly as effective as it has been purported to be, and that the actual like financial utility of a lot of it is, questionable. Like, what the fuck is going to happen to the internet if advertising dollar values like crash? Like that's really not probably how we should have built this thing in the first place. But I get, people wanted free, and so everything was built around the illusion of free.
So this is a conversation on Avatar 2. I don't know how we went out like 20 minutes on Google search or whatever, but let's
well, because it's the same. It's the same. It's like
what were we talking about? How do we get on this?
Just like the lowest common denominator, talking about like how like writing seems to be getting worse as the people that do the writing spend more time on social media, and that's like their primary like social pressure group that is exerting influence on their writing.
Oh yeah, they're trying to be, they're just so conversational, with the internet. By the way, stay like this the whole show. This is look at your vest when you're like this. No, do it. Yeah, stay like this the whole time. Yeah, you look great like this. Very big barrel chest.
I mean, like honestly, there is gonna really have to be a social movement to like almost religiously like purge the internet from our souls, like get off, minimize phone usage, minimize time spent online, maximize time spent in like substantive pursuits and like actually spending time with other people, because like clearly this is not working, like clearly whatever was going to happen, like whatever people thought was going to happen that was good has been mostly co-opted by the stuff that is bad. So and speaking of like things that can only proliferate on social media where people are hungry for novelty, like a world where Avatar 2 is like considered a serious work of art or whatever is like certainly on that list, is like it is on the list of like deleterious social media phenomena that are really only possible in a milieu of like a maladapted social media ecosystem. So there you
go. I guess we could close out a little bit on the whole maybe I mean, there were these charges, right, of cultural appropriation of like Native American groups. Specifically, he went to study some sort of tribe in Amazon to get some of his ideas here. First of all, I mean, like, does the cultural appropriation even matter? I mean, just because like it's, this is just such a kind of like piece of shit movie overall. Does that even matter, right? The charges of cultural appropriation. And second, what would the sort of counterfactual be, right? Because I can imagine the same groups that are upset about cultural appropriation, right, in terms of like, we have all these like noble savage tropes, obviously, right, with the kind of like beings in Pandora that they're supposed to be pure, they're supposed to be good, they're supposed to be very harmonious with nature, and it's really the outsiders that are causing all the kind of like major disruptions. Now, I mean, we know that historically, right, that's not accurate, right? I mean, obviously the biggest disruptions do come with the most kind of like lecherous and power hungry and money hungry groups, which would have to be, coming from everywhere outside of America. At the same time, we know that the Native American groups are obviously not in harmony with nature. Right? Anytime that human beings appear anywhere, right, they start moving out of Africa. Every continent that they go to, they start creating, massive extinction events, right, of the megafauna and then beyond, right? That's just kind of how it is for everybody. But I can imagine if that was maybe not touched upon, but if there was any kind of emphasis on this kind of stuff, like the everything the opposite of the noble savage myth, I can imagine the same kind of groups complaining about cultural appropriation and noble savage mythology, complaining that now we're sort of like presenting some sort of a light, justification for the slaughter of the Navi, right? Because I mean, especially since like everything here seems to be handled in a kind of like very clunky way. If the same person would now try to do something like, now Cameron write, the opposite of a noble savage, you might find something where it's like, damn, I kind of want to see these people die, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I'm gonna push back slightly. Just, I mean, certainly, I think it's fair to say that like the indigenous people of the Americas had a more balanced
well,
relationship
of
with
course,
their
yeah. I
natural
mean, I
world than
agree. I
Europe.
agree. Yes.
I mean, Europeans were sort of uniquely unbalanced from because
Hmm.
Europe is not a continent that was really meant to support the population density that it eventually came to have. Like Europe is some like for various reasons like required a lot of farming on pretty marginal land with pretty marginal yields just to support a lot of the increase the growing population density of that particular landmass, which is I think a lot of what inculcated the cultural values that allowed these sort of endlessly extractive approach to political economy that we saw blossom forth from the European continent into the rest of the world. So I do think there is something to be said for like in indigenous ways of like there are groups that learned something from their like extinguishing of the megafauna that followed the human spread into like every climatic region of the world. Like there are groups that learned better how to maintain an environment that was pretty replenishing of the things that they need without doing like a great deal of disturbance to like the overall ecosystem of a particular area.
Hmm.
Uh that's just like kind of a light pushback. I don't think the like honestly the it's really just like such an indigenous vibe in Avatar. Like there's not even anything specific
I
that
mean,
you
they're
can really.
literally using a bow and arrow, right, to
Yeah,
shoot down, mechanical, machine like flying machines, right?
yeah. I mean that's cool.
Yeah.
And I guess they're so big that like because I know there have been like Mongolians, the arrows they used were a lot more powerful than a lot of the arrows that like Europeans that they or even a lot of Middle Eastern groups that they came into contact with were using because they used longer bows with like more there's more tension on it, so the
Hmm.
arrows launched at a higher velocity. So I mean I guess, but it's just it like it's almost so non-specific a notion of indigeneity that it's like how can you get met like
Hmm.
it's like how like there's not any particular group that it's drawing like too much from, so it's I mean I guess they can all be like equally like slightly offended, but there's not anything like in particular to really get mad at. But you know I'm pretty sympathetic to some of the emerging like I don't know. Did you read the David Graeber book that came out in what was it 2021? I think.
No, what book? Who is this?
Uh, David Graeber is like a anarchist anthropologist who he did Debt the first 5,000 years. He did Bullshit Jobs. He was
Oh yeah, I
really
know that book.
prominent
Yeah.
in the Occupy movement
Hmm.
and is arguably partially responsible for that movement's like failure to really get any political traction because he was so big on like sort of decentralization and like
Hmm.
not having any real strict goals for the like strict goals that people could be like and organizational infrastructure that people could be accountable for and to because he's more on like the anarchist side of the tradition. So what the hell with Graeber and Rentgro, what the hell was that book called? Because I and the dawn of everything.
Hmm.
Yeah. And so, they make like a pretty not necessarily a totally solid, but like an interesting case that there was a sort of if there wasn't something that you would call civilization in the European sense, there wasn't something like Christendom that was like uniting North and South America, that there was sort of a general uh that there was like something like an alternative notion of civilization that pervaded like North and South America with these uh, overlapping groups of like people that use particular symbols that stretch across like tribal and linguistic boundaries. Like people could like travel, between places. Was like you can find stuff from like much farther away than like I guess the traditional anthropological notion of like how tribal affiliation and tribal self-identification, like a lot more mechanisms of like symbolic kinship, a lot, cutting across cultural and linguistic divides that earlier anthropologies might have might have tended to overemphasize like the hardness of those boundaries. So
Hmm.
like I'm pretty open to the critique that there was like a form of sophisticated civilization in the Americas specifically that was probably a lot more was more promoting of human freedom and flourishing, and certainly more ecologically sustainable over a long period of time than was present on the Eurasian landmass at the time of contact. I don't think like you don't have to buy into like noble savage mythology to say that like there were like prior to the last few centuries there were, or maybe even prior to like the last 70 years, the story of civilization is like a steadily like ratcheting up ability to like engage in brutalization of other people, like a greater and greater investment in like technologies of like violent centralization. And that for example, there is pretty much no historical record of like indigenous Americans like voluntarily defecting like into like European settlements, like leaving their tribes behind and hooking up with the Europeans. But there is a pretty well documented history of like Europeans going made like finding more fulfillment in like the indigenous American, or maybe Polynesia, like various indigenous ways of life, and finding a certain kind of fulfillment that really wasn't possible in like the Eurasian notion of civilization. So there is like a school of anthropology, like materialist anthropology and materialist history, that like you really do have to reckon with like the alternative form of civilization that certainly American indigeneity and maybe other forms of indigeneity as well, like present to the history that we got, which is basically like you know uh, like a game of chicken with our own like global climate that we're currently playing.
Hmm.
But this is just not the way to represent it, you know,
Mm,
like it doesn't have to, you know, like it doesn't have to be a goddamn cartoon of like, you know, good, like, because this is like even more simplistic than like fucking that, you know, than like 1910s, like, you know, the silent movie villain that ties the damsel in distress to to the railroad trackers, like all he's doing is fucking with one lady, you know. That's that,
mhm.
you know, that she might have been an asshole to him, we don't know, off, you know, off screen, but you know, this is so like, this is such a bad, like, if you're gonna say that there was like is a genuine uh anti-colonial, anti-settler form of civilization that various indigenous groups were engaged in that has been lost to settler colonialism, this is just such a bad way of representing that. Such a ham-fisted, cliche, boring, and not even particularly like viscerally thrilling and engaging, like, you know, it's not even as good as like, it's not even as good as like Terminator 2 or something like that, you know,
Mhm.
like at least if it was exciting as Terminator 2, then maybe you could give it a pass, but it's not. So claims of cultural appropriation, not that important because it's too broad and too generic, but also like, you know, who cares, because like I would say that there is maybe like valid out, like the outrage is not the appropriation, it's like the misappropriation, you know, it's the use of indigenous iconography for towards such hackneyed and cartoonish ends that like you like it is obscuring a genuinely rigorous and challenging critique that is to be made to like modernity and civilization as we understand it, you know.
Mhm.
And I don't know. Cameron's a smart guy. You really like. He should have known better, man. Like
Mhm.
you have to wonder. You know, it makes me think like, because there's plenty of PR of him, like, you know, screening the movie for like indigenous people, meeting with indigenous like political leaders and things like that, and it makes me think of former Automatic Nation guest Arnold Schroeder on his podcast talking about like, you know, the people that were in leadership positions of Native communities during the Standing Rock confrontation with the American government, with the oil companies in, what was that, 2017, 28? I can't remember, 2019.
20, that was
Trying to,
2017. Yeah.
yeah, like the younger like real activist types, they kind of wanted to engage in like sort of a continuing like series of escalations, you know, with the various interests that were trying to, you know, put this pipeline on their land. And it was really the formal leadership structure of the tribes that were, you know, sort of trying to back everybody down and defuse the situation and, you know, approach things more diplomatically, which proved to be an entirely like facile and stupid way, because Trump just basically, like, I think it might not be happening now just because the company got too much blowback, but like Trump basically came in after he got elected and said, fuck everything that you guys did, we're building the pipeline,
Mhm.
fuck, you know, like that was the plan at one point. So like it makes you wonder, like the people that Cameron met with to like get the clearance, you know, for, you know, to do something like this, like to assuage his guilty white liberal or anarchisty or whatever kind of vague flavor of leftist he is or thinks that he is or whatever, like, is it the same kind of people that were kind of giving him the okay, you know, like they thought it might bring money into the community or it might bring attention or what, you know, is it the same, like is it the younger, more passionate activist types that are given an okay, or is it these sort of like stodgy, you know, collaborationist, formal like centers of power in these communities? I think that's a, if there's anything in this movie that is probably a subject of scholarly interest, it is certainly that, and not the way that it characterizes and uses indigeneity as an aesthetic and rhetorical device.
All right. Well, I think we could end it here. This has been
Yeah.
a movie macro number 6. Like, subscribe. There's going to be a patron only show, as we discussed, for the patrons, and we'll see you again soon.
Peace.